Welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, where we interview top financial professionals and deconstruct their practices to give you an insider look into the world of finance. Here are your hosts, Lucas Muzialski and Leo Severino.
Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the Wall Street Lab podcast. Today we're deviating a little bit from our usual suit and tie themes of private equity and hedge funds, and we're jumping into the topic of angel investing. Luke just had a very insightful conversation with Richard Lucas. Luke, why don't you tell us more about who Richard is?
Richard is an angel investor who is currently involved with close to 20 different companies across a variety of industries. He has made many investments into the world-class startups over the years, including deals with startups backed by the likes of Y Combinator. For example, Richard was an early investor in the company Estimode, which won the 2013 TechCrunch Disrupt in the hardware category. Part of the reason why Richard is such a fascinating person to talk to is that he is involved in a variety of projects outside of his main work. He is the founder of Camp Entrepreneurs, an alumni network for the graduates of Cambridge University and others focusing on entrepreneurship. He is also the license holder of TEDx Kazimierz, which is a TED independently organized event in Krakow, and many more projects that he will talk about on this podcast. During the interview, we go all over the place, but we talk about how to approach an angel investor, how Richard selects his investments, and how he keeps track of the startups that he's involved with across different industries. Just one last thing before we jump into the interview. If you like what you hear, please rate us on iTunes. Good ratings really helps us in growing the show. And now, without further ado, please enjoy our interview with Richard Lucas. So, hello, Richard. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast to talk to us today. We could start off with the first question, which usually comes up. If you are at a party, or if someone from the extended cat family comes along who you've never met, how do you explain to them what is it exactly that you do?
I always find this quite an entertaining question because what I do is a bit unusual and confusing for people. And I say to people that I do a lot of different things, which for many people might be 10, 20, 30% of a full-time job. But as I do 6 or 7 of them, it means that I'm busy. I say that I don't really have a work-life balance. I have an activity-inactivity balance, and I don't like being inactive. And from my point of view, even having a conversation with them is part of my activity. I'm not very good at going on holiday. I say that I prefer to be inside the buildings rather than looking at them from the outside. So, for example, last year when I went to the TED Summit in Banff in Canada, I organised a meet-up with the TEDx Calgary people. The second day I was in Calgary, so I was like arriving in town, and I like to do things. Whether they're for-profit or non-profit is an interesting and important question, but I'm not. I make enough money with the things that make money to mean that I can afford to do the things that don't raise money that I also think are important. But I very think much go by the attitude that creating value is important, but value isn't always monetary value. So, for example, in the TEDx conferences I host, I do TEDx Kazimierz and monthly meetups. I say the key thing is that someone who shows up, they trusted us with their time. We have to, it's the same for these podcast listeners, they're trusting you with their time. They have to feel that it was a good decision to listen to the podcast, and if at the end of the podcast they think, what a waste of time, you have failed, even if there's no money involved in the short run. Same with the events. I say I don't want just people to think it was a good way to spend my day. I'd like them to say for my big TEDx events is a good way to spend their week, their month, that it might be the best day of their year and even their life, because I'm ambitious, which is a high threshold, obviously. In terms of business, I say that over the years I start companies and find other people to run them. It's been an evolutionary process where, I was doing what is now called angel investing before I'd heard of the concept of angel investing. So I didn't sort of read a book and think this is what I should do, or see a podcast, or the internet didn't exist when I started or wasn't available in Poland. So, I've got 5 or 6 companies that I live off because they pay dividends. I've never done an exit, and that's not because I've never been offered money for my businesses, but it's never seemed sensible to take money at 3 or 4 times earnings, because 3 or 4 years later you've got the same amount of money if the company doesn't fail and you still own it. So why would you do an exit? As well as supporting the companies. And then I'm not an organisation in the sense that I don't have a lawyer, an accountant, a project finder who delivers potential projects into a process where they're analysed. So, but I'm very active in the startup community and pro entrepreneurship support community, not just here in Krakow, although this is where I live. Krakow, for those of you who don't know, is a major city in the south of Poland. It used to be the capital and has quite a dynamic startup community, but also I do events in London. I did something in Canada. I'll be doing something in New York in April, and I run an organisation called CAM Entrepreneurs, for Entrepreneurial Alumni of Cambridge University. That's new, but it's a way to do something which is very much missing, which is to get going the idea that entrepreneurship is something that can be beneficial to people, whether they're entrepreneurs or not, in the sense that a policeman or a policewoman can be entrepreneurial if they see a problem connected with a local school, organise a meeting with the local youth centre or school director and discuss what to do about it. That's something that's probably not in his job description or her job description, but still they're seeing a problem and acting to solve it. Day to day, in my diary, I have some regular scheduled meetings with some of the smaller startups where literally it's a Skype call once a week, and then it's a key. And then what I help with is sort of what you might call non-scalable, unusual stuff. For smaller businesses, hiring is really important. That it's quite difficult to get experienced, talented people to consider working for a startup compared to the things that their parents will understand, like PricewaterhouseCoopers or Goldman Sachs or Google. It's really tough to get talented people to join your team. So sometimes having someone like me around, I arrogantly think might help, but it might put them off. And for some of the larger companies, we have like monthly board meetings where I and the other shareholders get together with the CEO. Then sometimes there are special projects. There's a medium-sized business where, on Monday there's a guy who we've met a few times who used to be big in the world of commercial real estate, and he's, we were talking about a joint venture with the company he used to work for. For some reason we don't know yet, he's parted ways, and we're having a meeting to discuss cooperation. So that could be a joint venture, it could be an executive hire, it could be a new startup idea he's going to lead and we'll have a share in. And I really don't know, but the CEO knows that I'm quite creative in deal making, and so I sort of he asked me to come along, and I'm happy to go. In terms of so that's on the sort of what you might call supporting existing businesses. Although I do consider new investment projects, I'm not being that active at the moment because I nearly got into trouble a couple of years ago where I bought out one of the co-founders of one of my earliest ventures, Unicard Spółka Akcyjna, which is is a people identification company, and the company was in trouble for reasons that aren't appropriate to discuss in this forum. I and some other shareholders thought it'd be a good idea to do a deal, so we bought the guy out. I bought his shares in 3 stage payments, but after I did that, one of the other businesses I'm involved in got into a bit of trouble, and I needed to lend money to that company, and we needed to lend more money to the company I'd bought out. So I had the purchase price and the credit support to a greater extent than I expected, which meant that although on paper I'm in quite a good situation, I was literally thinking, if we don't come out of that trough, I'm in real trouble. So I decided I needed to build up my capital reserves a bit before doing larger investments.
So you mentioned that you typically hold the companies for the very long run, which is what we see as a very untypical approach in the venture angel space from our perspective. I personally find it great because of the cycle that we typically see in the VC, where VCs come in for a few years, try to take as much profit of the company and they have a deadline to sell the company. How do you look at this, that you keep holding on to their portfolios and not liquidating your positions?
Okay, well, I think my personal story is important here, that when I started the first businesses back in, the first serious businesses, I was trading sweets in my school playground in the 1970s and getting into trouble with the school authorities because it wasn't allowed, and I had this idea of going into business, but didn't do anything in my teens because I was in a school that was very unsupportive of entrepreneurship, and it wasn't just a school. The whole culture of Britain back then wasn't. Despite if you were interested in business, you were a Thatcherite, and for teenagers that was very uncool and bad. And I was I wouldn't say I had a particularly strong personality back then. I was very influenced by the environment I was in. So when I moved to Poland in 1990, I set up a business when I graduated from Cambridge University, which didn't work out. It didn't go bust. I just had a tiny revenue compared to what would make any sense to carry on doing it. So I just had to wind that up and came to Poland having worked for a consulting company for just over a year. I didn't enjoy the consulting and was teaching in a business school just after the end of communism. And I was 24. There were about 40 students, average age 40. And there's a lot of stories connected with that. But one of my students came up to me after one of my third or fourth class and said, can you give us a bit more help? And he wanted some advice. And of course, as a helpful teacher, I was keen to do that. But within days, it was obvious they needed much more than would be normal. So in the end, I gave him some money. There was a deal literally on the back of an envelope with initials and shareholdings in percent, without any of the things that I'm sure all your listeners would regard as normal, like termination, drag along, tag along, senior executive compensation, change of control. There was nothing, just an envelope with shareholdings, not even things like management salaries regulated, which I wouldn't do these days. But I didn't do that at the beginning with the concept of an exit in mind. And if you don't build a company with an exit in mind, then you don't really prepare for it. And I was lucky enough, with hindsight, not to speak. I speak Polish well enough now to have passed the language test necessary for my Polish nationality application, because as listeners would probably can hear, I'm British, and being British isn't a very nice thing to be at the moment if you're an internationalist person who likes the idea of a country that's tolerant and welcoming to foreign influences. And Britain, Anglo-Saxon is German Viking, if you think about it from a sort of cultural, ethnic point of view. So I don't think, and I don't think being Anglo-Saxon is a particularly mono-ethnic concept. And I was forced to manage the company through other people from the get-go because I didn't speak the local language back in the 1990s, which actually made it relatively easy for me to step out of managing the business while remaining a shareholder. I think very often as the person who founds and starts their own business and then exits it, they're not just exiting for financial reasons, they're exiting for personal reasons, that they want to change their lifestyle, and you get really, really sucked into an intense way of living where the business is your life very often. And maybe that's great for some people, but it's not great for a lot of people because they didn't realize when they started that it's not just appearing in TechCrunch and being cool, but firing people and having people trying to bribe you, or really horrible things, pornography on company computers, and what do you do, or there's a whole lot of crap that rises up when you're running a business that you don't realize, that means that people sometimes want to get out. And I didn't exit. I didn't have an exit in mind at the start. Then later on, when the idea of selling the business came along, all these lack of clarity among the other shareholders about what meant sense came in. But we did have one or two sort of quite large multinationals, $10 billion a year multinationals come along and sniff around, but the offers they made weren't particularly good. A private equity company came in to another business I'm involved in and gave quite a decent valuation, but the valuation was to put money into the business. There would have been a partial exit, but then that would help us with our international acquisition strategy, because what we also discover, but then it's an iterative process, and the great advantage for listeners now is that you can be 19, listen to this, or even 10, 15, and think, oh well, I won't make the same mistakes as Richard Lucas, and congratulations, I'm really jealous of you guys for being able to compress all that knowledge. That we all got so many terrible offers from companies that wanted to buy us that we thought, well, if that's normal, it's much better to be an acquirer it's much better to buy than sell in this market. And if you buy someone with an earn-out, which is typical for a small company, if you get the deal structured right from the acquirer's point of view, you end up paying for the acquisition with the money made by the people you buy. So, you might be making $1 million a year. Someone offers you 4 times earnings. So that's $4 million. And the deal is you've got to grow it by 30% a year. So that 4 million goes up to, the $1 million you're going up goes up to 2 million. So, at the end of the day, you've paid very little because you don't give all the money. You give, half now, half later. So it's 2 million now and 2 million later, and you end up paying 1 million for the whole thing because 3 million of your 4 million acquisition price comes out of money of the people you've bought. Don't rip people off, please, if you're listening to this and think, it's good that everyone should win. So I didn't exit not because it was a philosophical thing. It's just never made sense. The other insight I've had is that when you're in a business, you get to many business opportunities as a result of being in that business. Almost all my businesses are B2B businesses. I've had very little success with selling to consumers. I've hardly ever tried. But when you're doing B2B, if you're selling to breweries, if you're working for them as a vendor, and you think, Jesus Christ, those guys have got a huge problem with, employee, I don't know what it might be, employee tracking. They don't know where their people are, or they're spending 5 minutes a day on this process that we could take to 1 second. If I think of estimate people tracking type, where is X? The answer, if X costs you $250,000 a year plus benefits, every minute you don't have X is really important, and X doesn't like filling in forms. So automation of work processes. You suddenly realize, well, if that could be a separate business, you're in the ID cards business, which I am, and you suddenly think, well, that could be an app, that could be a separate business. So not exiting sometimes gives you access to, and the great thing there, which I think is really important for people thinking about startups, is very few people who've not done it realize how hard it is to sell B2B with a startup. That big companies are cautious for a reason. They're because they've got a lot to lose. And if you're Walmart, you won't give your time and attendance systems to a startup because if it goes wrong, you're probably breaking all kinds of laws, which it's going to be all over the media. Hey, I went to Walmart and I couldn't go to the till because their employee check-in system had gone wrong. It's a huge issue for a big company. They're almost driven to deal with the Schlumbergers or the IBMs. And what we've got as a result of being in business for so many years is we've got Fortune 500 companies as clients, so we can test our startup ideas on our live customers. Because if you know the guy from PepsiCo well, and you say, well, it's your product manager goes to him and has a conversation about their current needs, and they say, well, we could do a pilot for you, and you define the pilot with the guy who trusts you, then that information that it worked for PepsiCo is your startup capital. You can go to your VCs, your seed investors, and say, look, well, there's, they always ask you about traction. And you say, well, our traction is that Pepsi wants to buy this when it's ready. Well, that's completely amazing compared to any other startup, because once you've got Pepsi, you can go to anyone and say, well, Pepsi's using it, and you don't have to say it's only Pepsi. You've got Pepsi as a client. So the exit wasn't a strategy. If anyone, if people listening want to talk to me about investing in any of the businesses, the answer is let's talk. It's not that we've ruled out exit, but some of them it's clearly the wrong time. Zalamo.com, we're just going international. That's a tool for professional photographers, which is growing very nicely in Poland, even though we haven't really cracked our sales process. And we're a market leader in Poland. We're just getting ready to go in English. But clearly, we'll get once we've cracked the sales process. This is a product which saves time and money. Saves time, makes money in large quantities for professional photographers. So our target is only professional photographers, typically who have more than 50 photo shoots a year. But the more, the better. And once we've got that going in English, actually, I don't really want to sell shares. Why would I want to sell a successful business? It's like, will I find anything as good as that with the money I get? So, it's always a question of making a judgment. But if with the my situation may be different from the other founders, because I'm not the CEO, so it's also a question of a discussion with the CEO about what they want. And sometimes if a person says to me, I want to build this company, I never want to sell it, I want to be someone significant in my marketplace, I say to them, well, look, if you think about it from an investor point of view, unless you're going to have a really generous dividend policy and, chuck out cash year after year, that's not a very attractive thing for the investor. So maybe you want to think about your story, because an angel investor isn't going to invest in a company that doesn't plan to do an exit ever, unless, they can say, well, look, we can make $1 million a year, pay you a 15% dividend, and, you'll get $150,000 a year for the next 20 years, and all I need is $200,000, or that's an incredibly attractive deal. I would go for that. So that's rather a long answer to your question, but we cover quite a few different things within it.
So going back to your portfolio, you are currently involved with close to 20 companies that cover a variety of sectors. Mm-hmm. And looking especially at the private equity and VC markets, we see more and more specialization. So companies or investors that would do only one certain kind of investment. How do you track the developments in different markets of the portfolio companies that you are involved with?
I agree with the idea that there's a huge benefit to focusing on a sector, but that's a scale issue for me. That I'm involved in the startup community. People come up to me with different ideas. One of the things that every investor, professionals included, will talk about is the character of the people leading the company, and like the sense of unusual manic desire to work like crazy and be successful is so important. That trumps any kind of sectoral specialization. Sort of Gary Vaynerchuk. I'm sure you've heard of, so many of the listeners will, if you listen to podcasts at all, you may have heard of Gary Vaynerchuk. Always talks about the problem of privileged kids getting involved in startups. Mummy and daddy helped them along. They sent them to a good school. They paid them to get them through. Went to Yale. Went to Harvard. They've never had a tough experience in their life, except that pressure of elite style family upbringing, and suddenly you're trying to sell automate coffee cup, corporate coffee cup logo delivery, and you discover you can't do it, and you go along to your family Christmas, you've lost $250,000 of your family's money, and it's a huge pressure. So you need to have those people who are slightly driven, who are quite comfortable with that setback and will just work harder when they face it. In terms of keeping track of the market, though, that's very much the CEO's responsibility rather than mine. However, I'm involved in I'm a media junkie. I'm online every day. I like to look at UK news because I'm from the UK, but also Reuters I find very good, and podcasts. The Economist is very much internationalist in its outlook, plus the fact my brother's a senior editor there at The Economist, so I have a sort of family loyalty. But so BBC, Financial Times, Economist, Reuters, Telegraph.co.uk, Guardian.co. I try to read from different perspectives, although I'm socially very liberal and financially quite conservative and very anti-nationalist, although I'm patriotic towards the countries I'm associated with, which are Poland and Britain. I want them to have good futures. That's not through nationalism. I was reading The Economist this morning. Yesterday there was something in The Economist about a new survey on lifetime learning. Notatek.pl is the leading student portal in Poland, and we've got three lines of business, one of which is corporate training and education, so it's training employees. So I just sent a link to that article to the CEO saying, take a look at this. When you've read it, maybe we should have a workshop with the staff there about it, because I think it's there's lots of insights into business models. But to do what I used to work for a consulting company. It was a joint venture with PA Consulting Group, which is quite a big consultancy. And I think that, in my experience, and that was confirmed by some of my colleagues in the consulting company, that in £100,000, and that was 25 years ago when £100,000 was a lot more money than it is now, in a £100,000 study, you'd only get 1 or 2 days that really matter. The rest of it is just flannel and sort of stuff that you can find out anyway without paying anyone to tell you. So the implication there is that, the insights that really matter, often ones that require a real specialist. And if the CEO of a company that's involved in peer-to-peer lending isn't well up on what's going on in peer-to-peer lending, you're in trouble. I mean, you want to, that can move on when we discuss how I screen ideas. If someone comes to me, they've got a great idea to do with, picking people up from airports, and they think that they've got no competition. It's just the thing. I'm still shaking my head. I'm thinking, does this guy, does he really know anything? Has he tried to buy what he wants to sell? Has he done the basic, what I would call competitive intelligence, a sort of scan of the marketplace? And if they're a developer, a geek, and they can code, then I'd still possibly and they've got some customers or some very strong validation, I'd possibly agree to have a meeting where the goal of the meeting is that you've got to find a co-founder who can take care of the commercial stuff, because someone who can code and build products that people like or love is an ideal co-founder for almost anyone else listening. So provided they've got basic interpersonal skills. So in terms of sort of keeping track of them, it's not my job. If I see something that's relevant, I send it to the CEO. If I see an opportunity, and I think of the world in terms of problems and solutions. So, I see something that's growing. Again, there's a new trend towards using DC rather than AC current for international transmission of electricity. And I remember a friend of mine who had a very quite large scale battery company in the UK that failed. I think they got through £18 million. So say 25, probably. So by the time you're listening, 18 million euros worth of capital. He had told me years ago when I was visiting him that he thought DC would be better than AC for a lot of applications in the home, and I sent him a link to the article I read or heard about it, and he just wrote about it. But the big problem with DC in the home is that it kills people, that it's dangerous, and so if someone listening can find a solution to the DC will kill you problem, that is extremely important. So you've got the problem defined, and I've no idea what it is. Maybe there's no solution, but if you can see the problem, and there will possibly be a trend towards DC rather than AC distribution of electricity for fundamental technological reasons, but there's this huge side effect. That it is more dangerous is important. So then you say, well, the thing that really matters in this marketplace is what problems do people have who do X, Y, or Z, and if you can define the problem, then you can think about the solution. And then, of course, it's, well, how would you make money out of it? Is there a technical solution? How would you make money out of it? Have you got the team and organization to deliver? How much money do you need to make that happen? And, what will I get in return if I help you? Type questions.
In terms of a typical process of angel investing, do you feel there is something like a typical process that you go through with each of your investments that you've made, or do you feel that each investment was an individual process?
I mean, from the clouds level, looking down, there's definitely a process. And I think the first thing, and this is quite important when you've burned your fingers and made as many mistakes as I have, it's ruling people out, is finding ways to say no. So the first thing is you're looking for red flags. So it's typically if I get a message via Facebook or LinkedIn is most common, or sometimes people come up to me at events. The first thing I do is there's an article I wrote which I'd like you to share in the show notes if you have them, called Tough Questions from an Investor on my blog, and I update it from time to time. But basically, and what I say to people, potentially, because people always want to meet me. I get these sort of, they've obviously read an article, seen a podcast, seen a slideshow about how to approach investors, and you get these rather strange messages that look rather crafted, talking about grabbing a coffee, and they're using Americanisms that are not part of my vocab because they think it's going to help. And I always steer them to this article and say, well, look, thanks for the approach. Take a look at this article. Try and answer the questions in it. And I said, because if I'm going to give you half an hour or 40 minutes of my time, I don't want to waste that time finding out stuff that you could have easily sent me beforehand. And very often that already rules people out. They say, no, I'm far too busy. I'm not going to invest my time on someone who's too busy for me. Maybe there's a mismatch between investment opportunities and entrepreneurs here, which means that I'm more accessible than some, because I think in sort of ultra, probably in London or Berlin or San Francisco, there might be more people approaching people like me than I get. It's not like I get dozens every day. I'm not that visible. But the first thing is to get people to give me a bit of basic information. If you go to Tim Jackson's fund in London, Lean Investments, they have a form. He's done as a sort of slightly. He's way more successful. He set up the British equivalent of eBay and sold it. And when it went public, it was at £400 million. So he did very well. He has a process for his fund, Lean Investments, where you fill in a form, very short form, and it's basically the same idea. You're trying to weed people out. Then if I'm not sure, I encourage them to come to an event at which I'm a host, because I do the open coffee cracker meeting every second Thursday morning at 8 a.m. And again, if it's too early for someone to get up, that's a very good red flag. If someone can't be bothered to get to somewhere for 8 a.m. in the morning, then no, it's unless they can code and they've got good interpersonal. Again, all the things that rule someone out. If they can code, they have good interpersonal skills, and they build products people love, I will be flexible, because that's such a rare, valuable skill set. It's like being a sort of a supermodel, an incredibly attractive guy who everyone wants to date. There's a certain sort of certain things that allow you to get away with a lot of other red flags. Although there are red flags even for the guys who can code and have good interpersonal skills and build products people love. So then once I've got to the stage of meeting the person, they've gone through those hoops, then there's a personality match. I said, can I imagine looking forward to meeting this person once a month? Or if I wasn't around and someone met that guy and they said they're in business with me, would my reputation be enhanced by the fact that basically I'm looking for people to make a better impression than I do? It's just like it's not a no-go if they don't, but I really definitely, if someone's got really weird interpersonal skills, they're maybe it's political, like they're racists, or they're making jokes about Jews or blacks, or they seem to be pro politicians who I detest without giving anything away about politics, although possibly you can infer from things I've said earlier, then that's going to be a red flag. Can they clearly communicate their business idea? And very often people will say, I want to show you my product. And then I say, look, please, I don't want to see your product. I want to hear about your customers or your users or your potential customers, your potential users. And they start getting out their laptop. And I say, look, shut your laptop. Please don't show me your product. I'm not interested in your product yet. I want to hear about the use cases, what problems it solves. And if people don't get that, they say, but I want to show you my product. Then I think, well, fuck you. Sorry, I told you I didn't want to, and you're ignoring me. You're not listening. If you can't listen, you won't be a good business person. It's like I told you very clearly, and I say, look, it's nothing personal. I always say this: don't show me your product. That's not the first step. Tell me about the users, the potential users, and the problems it solves. And then, if they say, well, this is a product for postmen, postmen keep on being bitten by dogs. They spray this on their legs, and they spray my product on their legs, and the dogs run away. I say, oh, really? That's interesting. And then they say, and what's more, Poczta Polska, Bundespost, Royal Mail, and the USPS have run pilots, and they absolutely love it. Then I'm extremely interested, because or I went to see the head of personnel safety at the Polish post office. Then I start having a sense of this person is serious. They take their idea seriously enough, because there is this sort of scenario now, particularly in the startup world, where it's so cool and fashionable. People think that it can be an easier life than getting a regular job with Goldman Sachs or PricewaterhouseCoopers or McKinsey, which is a tough thing to. Those are tough jobs to get. Obviously, most people can't even get them. But if there's this sort of sense that instead of earning whatever it is, I don't know how much you get. Do you know how much you get paid if you join Goldman Sachs or McKinsey in Berlin, in Germany these days?
I'm not sure exactly about these companies, but an entry analyst position at a typical investment bank can expect to earn somewhere between 50 and 70,000 euros without a bonus. I believe that's something that the latest statistics say. 50
to 70. Okay, so I'm even out of date. So then that means that people think, if I can have a startup and have that standard of living, I would prefer it. I'm not surprised, because if you have a huge equity kicker and you can get that sort of salary, who wouldn't go for that? That it's cooler to have a startup. So but then people they're looking for the slightly less informed angel who thinks they're going to have the next Facebook and they're ready to take a wild punt on, this very slick 24-year-old who could be in McKinsey, and they're super intelligent and speak 3 languages, including Chinese, and they've got all the right things. But that person isn't necessarily the person who's got the business drive and determination. They've clearly got determination if they've educated themselves to such a high level, but what is the business? Do I understand their business model? Can they clearly communicate it? Do I understand how they're going to make money? And the business model is important. There are a lot of people who have rather limited experience for very good reasons. They've not done that before, who haven't understood the problems of a sustainable business model. Then it's like, what have they got that will be hard to replicate, or their edge? And is there something in their setup which means that it's reasonable to think that once they suppose they start coming up with a solution for gas stations that make it slightly less unpleasant to fill your car with diesel or petrol, what is going to stop the incumbents, Gil Barco and Wayne Dresser and all these people who put gas pumps, just like the incumbent competitive response is really important. They say, well, we've got this patent. If the guy says to me, or the girl says to me, that's a great question, that's our biggest threat. So what we've done is we've patented this. We've got X, Wayne Dresser, Gil Barco, and other gas pump people on our advisory board. Our preferred exit is a trade sale to one of those 3 companies where we want to get them in a competitive situation where they all want us. And, then at least there's this, so they've thought about it, they've understood, because, you don't want to be going head to head with an easy to replicate retail model with Walmart. It's obvious that Walmart or Tesco or Lidl, you've got extremely powerful, rich, well-organized companies with fantastic relationships with both their client base quite often and their vendors, and it's going to be really hard. So there's sustainability, and then the fourth bit of the jigsaw is do they have the knowledge and experience of putting a team together to deliver on this? That you can have the best business model and the idea, great technology, but if someone's never hired anyone or managed anyone and they haven't yet got their team together, then that's a lot. It's a lot harder than you think, even when you've got money to put a team together to deliver, and to build an organization which can actually be effective. And I give the really simple examples from way back 25 years ago when I had my SKK, my first business, barcode systems company, selling barcode scanners and printers to industrial companies and utilities. What you need to do to have a man in a suit with a product who's trained with maybe a laptop, not back then, who can make a presentation in a city 250 miles away as well as you would do it if you were there. That requires an awful lot of organization, which is not rocket science. None of it's difficult, but it is difficult to actually do that any kind of scale, because that guy needs to be insured. Is he going to be booking his own hotels? How do you decide what his expenses policy is? If you've got millions of dollars from some angel who doesn't care, then possibly you can learn by doing. But I would rather see someone who's whether they've organized student society trips from one city to another, and they say, the key thing is you just have a list of, you're allowed to stay in Ibis and Formula, but nothing more expensive, and whatever it is. And you just have a sense this person's organised something, because if you put too much money in the pocket of someone who's inexperienced, it will get wasted, and I hate waste. I also went on a course, a short course at the Judge Business School in Cambridge, and a guy who's a very successful British entrepreneur made hundreds of millions. He said after he'd done his first exit and he had lots of money and he was negotiating a deal with a company that had a really interesting software product, and everything was great, and he did the deal, shook hands, and he decided to go and visit them. A couple of weeks later he drove into the car park and he saw 7 brand new Mercedes in their car park. And he thought to himself, you fucking idiots. And then he thought, I'm a fucking idiot. And, there's that sort of, sometimes it's such basic things go wrong. So you're looking for someone who has sort of thought about these things, who's not going to be learning by doing. If, in this, it's extremely early stage, which is where sometimes I come in and, if I'm giving someone 20,000 zloty or paying their bills for a few months while they go through getting to that process, maybe I'm ready to live with a higher level of lack of experience for a much lower valuation and much less money from me. The final thing is sort of ethic. I mentioned, their politics, but there's this sort of ethical framework that, I'm 50 years old and I don't want to be in business with people who I might be ashamed of in the future, and whether it's to do with basic, not doing business with them. And I've been to a meeting where a man opened a briefcase and there was $30,000 in cash and a gun. That only once in my life, but that's or I've heard of people who who've been to meetings where clearly other people in the room might be on the dark side. We're in an extremely dangerous time, and we're closer to dangerous countries to the east than you are, but there are people who put microphones in and video cameras in rooms who do all kinds of things which, basically, even if you can possibly make a fortune at the end of every day or week or month or life, you want to be able to look in the mirror and think that you were proud of the way you did it. So there's that sort of fundamental ethical smell test, and you can chuck in a few questions about how they might handle situations where clients are hinting that they'd like some kind of incentive to become clients or whatever, and just see how people handle it. And an experienced person will know that yes, that's a serious issue. It will happen, and this is in some might say I've never been in this situation, so I don't know, but this is what I would say, and or you might say, well, how will you instruct your staff on it? Because it's one thing to say, well, I'll take a personal decision. It's another thing is how do you train your sales guys, right? And so you find things out about people. I've possibly left. Oh yeah. Also, how much money do they need? How much money do they need, and what are they going to do with it? If someone, and also, what is their valuation? And quite often I have these conversations. People say, "Well, what's your valuation?" They say, "Well, it's complicated." And I say, "It's not complicated." Your pre-money valuation is not complicated. I know it's difficult for you because I might be ready to agree to a higher number than you're going to say. But just say, well, how much have you got, or as high as possible? That implies they haven't got a very clear plan as to what they want to do with the money. Is with younger people, they often haven't realised that it matters as an investor whether the guy's planning to pay themselves €2,000 a month, 3,000, 4,000, or 10,000 a month. And if you don't have your CEO salary regulated, then there's potentially a zero profit situation in perpetuity, because whenever you make more money, you just give yourself more bonuses as the management board. And this idea of a sort of experienced set of people all around who can take a decision on that and come up with an appropriate package for the founders is important. Other shareholders is important. Like, have they talked to anyone else? Is there anyone else in the room who, in their setup, who their partners are? Have they got some kind of commitment? Because sometimes, not quite surprisingly often, you find there's some young entrepreneur, but it turns out they're backed by someone like me who wants to get a much higher valuation than they got. And it's quite nice to know that there's the money you're expected to put in is actually someone else's exit. I'd like to know that in advance rather than not.
Thank you. I think we've learned a lot there about the process. Do you have your favorite portfolio company that you have invested in? And if so, how did this investment come about? I think I have to be I'm not going to answer that question directly except with respect to one business, because it's a bit like children. That if you imagine this conversation about you've got 4 kids and someone says, what is your favorite child, and then your kids are listening to that creates all kinds of problems for me later, which I don't want to have. I think of the companies that I'm involved with that are different, just fundamentally different to all the others, there's Argos Multilingual, which is it's in the top 50 in the world in professional translation. We acquired a company in the States 2 or 3 years ago where the CEO, Kimon Fontakidis, is a very effective leader. I got involved in that because we have another business together called PMR, which used to be a sort of regional version of the Economist Intelligence Unit or
a company like that did business information in English for foreigners doing business in Poland. That PMR was short for Polish Market Review, so for foreigners doing business in Poland who didn't speak Polish. And I'd seen his name on the publisher on the back of this thing that thudded through my letterbox. In those days, it was still coming by post back in the 1990s, and I went to see him because I had an idea of them producing a study of the market for barcode systems in Poland. And it turned out he had another business called Argos Translations back then. Now it's Argos Multilingual. Literally, it was just him and one assistant back then, but he's built that company. Why do I like that company? He's attracted the best talent in the industry globally to work in the business. So people from top companies in the world. It's as if we had people from Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. It's extraordinary. He's done such a good job of attracting talent into the business. He runs it as a real business, so it's it's very, very profitable and has top clients. We're still not that big in the industry, but the potential. Translation is a very, very interesting business. The world's largest company was taken private, Lionbridge, just a few. In fact, in the show notes, I'll post a link to his blog, which is really interesting as well. Anyone listening who's got a translation company, we might want to buy you potentially. But in the sort of $2 to $10 million revenue range. At the moment, we might do bigger acquisitions in the future. But what's interesting about that business is that it is possible to build a world-class company, and attract world-class people based in Krakow in Poland. And it was global from the sort of get-go. It was never focused on the local market. And so there's a mixture of good culture, a very strong focus on numbers and results, which, again, and in some of the other businesses I'm involved in, there's quite a sort of... It's quite a controversial topic. Now, are we a friendly, nice company, or are we a financially driven company? And it's very nice to have examples in the things I'm involved in where they can be both. Because in fact, why can Google treat its staff so well? Because it's fabulously profitable. It's being very successful financially is a precondition to being a really great employer. Because if you're not very successful financially, you won't be able to compete in the market for talent as effectively as if you can be touchy-feely friendly. But if everyone knows, well, you get paid more working for the competition. That's not a very good situation to be in, which isn't to say that money's everything, but you have to be competitive. But beyond that, I really wouldn't, there are different companies that have been successful for different reasons. I would come back to the financial side that I think is really important to have financial success as part of what a company is about, because a company that doesn't make money is a hobby, not a business, from my perspective. And, it's not... I used to play tennis many years ago, and I played with a French guy, and I said to him, after he'd thoroughly beaten me, I really just play for fun. And he said, yes, I play for fun, but it's most fun to win. And I feel like in business, if you're not making money, you're not more than your average for the industry, you're not more than averagely successful. Your profitability is a benchmark of your success. And obviously there are other things that are really important too, like, are you proud of the way you make money? But I use the example, I do quite a lot of entrepreneurship workshops in schools and universities, and I always say that if you're thinking about the sort of company you want to be, imagine you're a doctor or a lawyer in a private market environment. Obviously, in some countries you have very few private doctors, but if you imagine you've got a child and your child starts groaning and clutching its stomach and screaming in the middle of the night, you don't yell to your husband or boyfriend or girlfriend, find me the cheapest doctor you can, or find me the best value for money you can. You say, find me the best doctor you can, because it's really important. And ditto if you're sleeping peacefully in your bed and suddenly some horrible secret policeman people smash down the door, slap you in handcuffs, put a hood over your head and lead you out of the door. You don't yell to your girlfriend, find me the cheapest lawyer you can, find me the good one. You really want to be in a situation where you're on the list of good ones when it matters. And obviously there are companies like Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, in Germany, there are companies that have achieved that sort of, they're one of the good ones, the ones who you go to when it really matters. I think that part of being proud of your business is to say, well, you're not necessarily the cheapest, but you're one of the good ones. it's not always true, but even companies like Rio Tinto Zinc, RTZ, which say in their corporate strategy they want to be the lowest cost mining conglomerate in the world, they're not necessarily the cheapest, but they've got the lowest cost, so they can be cheap. When the going gets tough, everyone will go bust before them, but at the same time, they're probably selling it because they sell commodities. I don't actually, I haven't looked at their strategy for decades, but I remember thinking, you want to have really efficient, really low cost, high wages, and because high cost and low wages are not the same, are not incompatible. People think they are, but Switzerland and Norway and Japan managed to be big and Singapore managed to be big manufacturing countries despite having very high costs, because they're so efficient that you're proud of what you do. You have good conditions for your team. Your customers show off about doing business with you because you're such a good vendor. People boast about, I got my phone from Apple because it's like the high price is a validation of the fact that they're good. If the phones were really crap, no one would buy them. So I don't want to go into business by business analysis of each of the companies because it's not that they're all great. It's not that any are terrible. It's just that there are different issues with each of them, and it's quite a personal thing to start analysing your CEOs and company teams on a podcast to an unknown audience. So that's not the appropriate forum for that.
Completely understood. So let us switch gears a little bit and talk a bit more about some personal questions and routines. If you were to give advice to your younger self, let's say 15 years ago, what would that piece of advice be?
That's a good question. I know it's a kind of standard question, but obviously borrow as much money as you can and buy stock in Google. I don't think Google existed back then. I haven't talked about my personal situation. I got divorced about 15 years ago in 2003, so slightly less. And I think in the long run, I'd say that was definitely, it was my decision, the right decision. I get on pretty well with my ex-wife now, but I think that that was my equivalent of the midlife crisis, because I'm 50 years old now, so you're talking when I'm 35, and I think that Gary Vaynerchuk's absolutely right about this sort of self-awareness issue, like getting to know yourself. Like, because my American business partner, Kimon Fontakidis, who runs Argos, says, you always should be asking yourself three questions of the person you're negotiating with. What do they say they want? What do they think they want? And what do they really want? And, it's like a sort of, it's not necessary. A lot of people driven by the need to validate themselves in the eyes of either I think Milan Kundera says it in the book of Laughter and Forgetting, that some people want to be admired by the random stranger on a train, some people want to be admired by their family and friends, a close community, and some people just want the love and admiration of one person. All of these things may be true at different times in people's life, but I feel very much now that the key thing is your self-assessment. It's how you feel when there's no one there. When how you feel about how you're spending your time, and obviously, what makes one person happy won't be the same as making another person happy, but there's an awful lot of people living to try and tick multiple people's boxes. But I think if someone really cares about you, then they should care about how happy you are, not whether they can show off about you as their cool friend who's doing X, Y, and Z. So that's not, and for some people, money may be very important. For other people, it may be more about their status in their family. But if that is the case, fine, but you should be doing it for you, not for them. So the sort of fundamental selfishness, which isn't to say you should be bad, but if you care about helping the dog home and that's what really matters, stop going to those business networking meetings after work to improve your career and start going to the dog home and take the dogs for walks, because that's what you care about, not so I'd say self-awareness. And I recently did a podcast in Polish about failures, and I talked about my largest scale business failure, which was a mobile telecom infrastructure company where it was a mistake to get involved, and my way of dealing with that was going into denial, which meant that I kept on lending the company money even though the other shareholders couldn't afford to. So I increased my loss over time until a friend told me that it really wasn't sustainable. But so I'd say I'm talking about mistakes. One is not knowing yourself well, so figuring yourself out. Second is if you're going in the wrong direction, admit it to yourself. Like, you have to sort of like, which is part of self-knowledge, but it's not exactly the same thing. If things are going wrong, be ready to say stop. Don't put up with unacceptable things. There's a great Australian comedian called Tim Minchin who is so famous now. I mean, he's on Broadway. He did the Matilda play. He's a brilliant pianist and singer. I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy, and I'm involved in trying to get the stand-up comedy community going here in Krakow. If you go to YouTube, again, I'll share it in the links. He gives a talk to recent graduates from his alma mater in Australia, and he says, don't have dreams. Don't have a dream. If you have a dream, this is very fashionable to tell young students, recent graduates, to live your dream. He said, if you have a distant dream, you may spend all your life working for your long-term dream. When you make huge sacrifice, and when you finally get there, it'll turn out not to be that good, and it'll be too late. So he said, have short-term, put your effort into short-term goals. I'm not sure he's right, but I think the idea that there should be things you're doing at the moment that make sense to you now. For example, I haven't done an exit. I've still got a credit on my house. I know a lot of people think their key thing is to pay off their credit, pay off their mortgage. But I think, I could get sick. I could like have an accident. Something could go fundamentally wrong in my life, or one of my kids could get sick, which means that I have to change my priorities, not because I don't want to, but it's just the right thing to do. And I can't do some of the things I want to do. So, I do things which, in a way, it might be more rational to put off till later now, because I don't know when I'm going to stop being able to do those things. I'm extremely bad at prioritizing, and I think that I never was good at prioritizing, but I think that's I regard that now as a feature rather than a bug. I multitask the whole time, but I like to work with people who don't multitask, are really focused, and I feel a strong sense of hypocrisy here, that there's something wrong with saying that it works for me but it shouldn't work for you. I'm not sure how well it works for me. So in terms of just coming back to the sort of thing, what would I say? There are some fundamental things about self-knowledge, mistakes that you should avoid making. Focus on things that make you happy, not in the sort of getting drunk or drugged up in the short run, but things that you basically feel good about the way you spent your day and your week and your month, not just huge sacrifices. Because it may be really horrible doing 16 sales presentations in 16 days in 16 different cities, but if you believe in the thing you're working on, that's fine. You that pain is a bit like working out. It may be a struggle, but if you're working on the purpose that you care about, all that incredible effort is completely worth it.
Getting back to the personal questions, maybe you could share a bit about what you do in your free time and what takes up most of it. We know that you are involved in many fascinating projects outside of your main work. Maybe you could share a bit about what you're up to.
Okay, I've been very involved in the TED and TEDx. If you don't know what TED.com is, I don't believe you live. TED and TEDx, I've spoken at, sponsored, I've been on the organisation team in the last 3 years, organised TEDx Kazimierz, which is the Jewish district of Krakow, and we very much believe in community building, evangelising for TED and TEDx. I'm particularly proud of some of the talks you can see on, I'll share those in the show notes, particular talks at the TEDx Kazimierz I've organised, but we also do monthly meetups. I go to TEDx's in other cities. I'll be going to New York for the TED Fest, where we'll be watching live stream with TEDx's from all over the world in the last week of April this year. And I'm not particularly religious, but I feel that TED and TEDx are very much the sort of optimistic side on a relative thing of things that go right in the modern age. It's you have to do it for free. You're not allowed to charge. Speakers have to do it for free. They're not allowed to charge. Considering how much they do, TED works on a minuscule budget. I think it's $40 million a year, but to build there's a global mega brand and all the TEDx stuff, that's big. In terms of entrepreneurship support, I host a couple of networking meetings, Krakow Enterprise Mondays and Open Coffee Krakow. I have a very strong conviction that a lot of events are extremely low quality, or let's say not low quality, but they're not done nearly as well as they could be done. And it's not to do with money; it's to do with experience and imagination. That I'm a great fan of high value added, which means a huge gap between the price the price charged and or the value created and the cost. So giving people expensive drinks doesn't make it a high quality event; it makes it an expensive event. I think people can get very bored at events even when there's a high budget, and boredom is the biggest turn off, or the worst thing I can imagine you can do to someone is to make them bored. And it's even worse if you're boring them when you had the money to buy champagne and expensive sandwiches, because then you could use the money to make it better. So a huge emphasis on audience participation, welcoming people, and I've got a lot of the things I've learned about that from TED events and TEDx events, but some I've figured out for myself. And I do, and then recently I think there's a global. This may be something that I do that is of actual sort of global significance. Is that Europeans are extremely bad at using their alumni networks to good effect, and Americans are relatively good at this. The exception of business schools. Business schools have to do good alumni relations because it's part of their ranking in the business school rankings, but for everyone else it's lamentable. And so I've, in cooperation with as part of the process that's allowed by Cambridge University, I've set up CAM Entrepreneurs, this organisation for alumni from Cambridge University, and I say it's Cambridge and not Cambridge only, so I'm potentially able to partner with you. I've done three. I've done one of the first event was in December last year. We'll be one in London next month in February, 23rd of February, and one in New York in 29th of April. So we're launching globally. And the basic idea is that one of the reasons the situation is so bad in Europe is that almost everyone perceives the only reason to be involved in the alumni network is to listen to people asking you for money. That it's a fundraising exercise, and that's the only KPI that really matters. And whether it's a dinner, there's always that speech, and an organisation that kicks off with the begging bowl by the door isn't really that attractive. And in fact, you can put the alumni networks to people are self-organizing thanks to technology, thanks to all the LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups, and so on. Are self-organizing anyway, and the alumni networks are perfect platforms on which people can find communities of shared interest where you've got that historic thing together, which increases the trust level. And we can do way more with this. It's not the only show in town. It's not unique. But for my public school, the Winchester College, the history of this was that the school I went to, Winchester College, which is one of the most high-profile elite public schools, i.e. private schools in the United Kingdom, organised a meeting to do with business, and I and one of the other people there thought that it could be better than it was, and heard that another school in the country called Eton, which is a sort of historic rival, 3 alumni from Eton who had all been to Stanford were linked up via the Stanford network because they all worked in Silicon Valley doing different things, and it suddenly struck them that they, despite having gone to the same school, they were linked by an American organisation, despite all being British and having gone to the same high school. So they set up something which is really working called Etonpreneurs, and that's a kind of benchmark. But I'm more ambitious than that, and I think that in principle, if what I do with Cambridge works, this is something that could be a role model for educational organisations and schools all over, well, certainly in Europe, but possibly all over the world, because it doesn't have to cost money to make an extremely high value added event. Apart from that, I got involved in stand-up comedy when I was running a company 2 years ago and felt I couldn't do it while I was being a professional CEO, but I've started doing stand-up comedy. I went on to comedy school in Brighton in England in the summer, and with a guy here with a group of people, we've started the CAIA stand-up comedy scene because we're in a tourist mega destination here, and it's a chicken egg problem, as with many businesses. Until there's good supply, why would people show up? Until people show up, how do you get good people to come and perform? But I like challenges. So there's the Wojtek the Soldier Bear project, which I run a global community on the Facebook about a bear that fought in the Second World War. And literally on Wednesday this week, there was an Iranian film crew in the apartment of a 91-year-old who remembers looking after this bear during the Second World War. They fought together at the Battle of Monte Cassino. And this guy, Wojciech Naremski, who talked at my TEDx Kazimierz conference, when I ever am having a bad time or things are tough for me, and sometimes they are, I think of him because when he was 16, he was arrested by the Soviet KGB or NKVD, was in a prison camp where in a cell with 60 people, then in a prison camp where it's minus 50, and lots of the people he was with died. He had this incredible trek as a child through the Middle East, Italy, fought at the Battle of Monte Cassino, trained as a geologist, became a professor in communist Poland, and he still has a smile on his face. He's physically very small, not very well, but I sort of feel if he can do what he's done with his life, privileged people like me, and possibly many of those listening, have absolutely no excuse not to do the best they can with their lives. And yeah, I'm open to new projects as well. I sort of feel that there is other stuff I'm doing, but I feel possibly the time is... I have a blog called richardlucas.com. I do a podcast called projectcashmere's.com. And my sort of tagline, my personal tagline, coming back to sort of close the circle of how I introduce myself, I say to people I like to have fun, make money, and be useful. And if I can do all those three things at once, that's absolutely perfect, provided I'm delivering my responsibilities to my family and friends. But even if I do one of those three things, I'm still pretty happy. So I haven't closed the list of things I'm doing.
Perfect. We'll post notes to everything that you're doing in the show notes. So if anyone's interested, you can check out a set of links over there. Since we have to respect your time, I would like to thank you for the interview, and we hope to stay in touch.
Before you go, as you have probably figured out by now, we release an episode on Thursdays every second week. So episode 6 will come out on February 9th, and we'll be talking to the Director of Exams for the CAIA designation. So if you're interested in alternative investments, make sure you stay tuned for that. Thank you, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you for listening to the Wall Street Lab podcast. For the show notes and much more, visit us at www.thewallstreetlab.com. To see what we're up to before anyone else, subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
The information contained in this podcast constitutes the opinions of individuals and should not be treated as investment, tax, financial, or legal advice. We take no responsibility for the accuracy of any statements made in this podcast. Any copying, distribution, or reproduction of this podcast without the permission of the creators of the podcast is strictly prohibited.